We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Archaeology Show. TAS goes behind the headlines to bring you the real stories about archaeology and the history around us. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the Archaeology Podcast, episode 87. I'm Chris Webster, and on today's show, we talk about the American Flat Mill near Virginia City, Nevada, with Alicia Jensen of the Nevada BLM and Ron Reno. Let's dig a little deeper. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we have Ron and Alicia on the phone. And Alicia, why don't you tell us what we're talking about today? Introduce the topic for us.
Okay, sure. So today we're going to talk about historic 1920s mill. It's called the United Comstock Merger Mill, but it has a local name of the American Flat Mill. So we usually just call it the American Flat Mill. Some people call it the Flats. It's a mill that was historically significant, located on Bureau of Land Management lands here in Nevada.
Yeah, well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the American Flat Mill? Like, what did they do there?
So it was a mill that used cyanide processes to mill low-grade ores and tailings that were previously not profitable to mill. And this is in the area of the Comstock that has a really rich history of mining in the mid-1800s, late 1800s. So the American Flat Mill represents the latter history of the Comstock because it was in the 1920s. So it's significant because it kind of represents what some people call the last gasp of the Comstock, the last attempt to do large-scale mining and milling in this area. And the mill used cyanide to process materials and process silver and gold. And that was, it's not the first mill to ever do this, but it's significant because at the time, it was the largest mill doing that at the time in the United States.
Okay. What years was this mill active?
So the mill itself was actually really short-lived. It was open in 1922 and then shut down 1926.
Wow, that is short-lived. Jeez. One of the things, and I don't know if you have this information or not, but one of the things that I like to hear when we talk about mills, because I've been up to Virginia City, you go all over the place and people talk about the amount of dollars and stuff like that was processed at such a thing. Do you guys have that information? Like in that very short period of time, how much, I don't know, value there was? Because that's always kind of an interesting number to think about.
Through its history, this mill processed close to 2 million tons of ore, and it yielded over $7 million in silver and gold.
Jeez.
And it was very efficient. It was a 90% mill recovery.
Wow. There you go. Let's talk a little bit more about the mill. How did it start? Where did this thing come from? What was the idea behind it?
It's based on this idea that this new cyanide technology that's come out opened up more opportunities for milling materials that previously would not have been able to be milled because there wasn't enough ore, like low-grade ores or tailings.
Okay.
And so there were these two mining engineers that were really important to starting off the mill. One is called Alex Wise. The other guy was called Roy Hardy. And they started exploring around the Upper Gold Hill area there near Virginia City. And they acquired a bunch of leases in that area around 1920. So they, originally they were backed by a guy named Herbert Humphrey, who was a local rancher and banker. But when all this activity that was happening got the attention of investors out in the Northeast, like Chicago and New York, probably people that never, ever went to Nevada, which is kind of funny when you think about it. So they started putting money into this project of using the new technology of cyanide to process ores from Virginia City area, Gold Hill area. So about $5 million was invested into this project, which is a lot.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us? I'm curious. I mean, they put so much money into this, and then, I mean, if $5 million was put into this project, and Ron mentioned something about $7 million kind of coming out of it, it didn't seem like it was open long enough to really be beneficial for the owners of this. So what caused it to fall into decline and close?
Yeah, so it ended up being a failure, obviously.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of reasons that happened, that it closed so early. A lot of it has to do with overestimation of the ore value. People really thought that there was a lot more there than ended up being there.
Mm-hmm.
And you had silver prices falling during that time. So silver fell from about $1 to 67 cents per ounce during the lifetime of the mill. And it just continued to fall until it was about like 62 cents per ounce in 1926.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really a number of different issues that the mill was having. The operating costs were also a little bit too optimistic. You know, what they thought they could do for a certain amount of money ended up being more expensive in reality. So it was kind of all these things combined.
Wow. Okay, man, that's
one,
crazy.
One of my favorite problems that they had was part of what they were doing was reprocessing waste rock that had been used to fill old stopes, which are the large hollows dug under Virginia City and Gold Hill themselves. They removed so much of this that the town was starting to subside, threatening the main street and the large school at that end of town.
Jeez.
So there's a lot of social pressure to stop removing the fill that was holding up the town.
Yeah, I can imagine. So speaking of that, at some point, this came into the attention of the BLM, and you guys studying this. And what about this mill is special? Is it just its place in history? Is it the architecture? What about this mill is special that makes it something that causes us to talk about something that was only in existence for 4 years?
So I work in the Sierra Front Field Office here in Carson City. One thing that's really unique just from a BLM perspective is that we don't have a lot of standing buildings and structures from the historic era in our field office. You know, a lot of those buildings may be on private land, or if they were on BLM, they had been lost already. So this was a pretty big site to still be existing on BLM lands. And, it was a popular place for people to visit. It's not very often that we have historic sites that are so beloved by locals and like well known that people go and visit just for fun all the time, or they used to anyway.
Yeah. Because
now the mill isn't there. But like I was saying previously, a lot of people, when they think about the history of Virginia City and the Comstock, they think of the 1800s era, mid 1800s, late 1800s. This is a latter part of the history of that area. So it's cool to see a window in that time frame after there's already been so many like booms and busts throughout the history of this Virginia City National Historic Landmark. So, and that's the other thing that's a big deal about it, is it's part of this historic landmark. So it has ties to the past on the Comstock.
What about this mill makes it so unique besides the time period? I'm thinking architecture, things like that, but also I guess tied to that question, and let's talk about this question first, is what is actually left? What's still up there, or what was up there when this was studied? If it's been taken down now, I don't even know what remains.
Architecturally, it's a really good example of a style called international style of architecture. And that style is characterized by being very functional, stark, and unadorned, and having a lot of geometric patterns, not a lot of embellishments. So at the time before it was demolished, all the buildings are gone now. There were 8 buildings that got recorded by the report, of which Ron is one of the authors, and which why he knows so much.
Mm-hmm.
So, you've had the core crushing building, the fine grinding building, warehouse, the cyanide plant itself, had a lot of remains visible. And it's kind of hard to explain. I wish we could look at it all together, on the website or something. And I was really lucky that I got to go there before it was demolished several times.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're standing there, it just felt so big all around you. And you definitely could understand why people were drawn to it and wanted to explore all of the, crevices and all that. So they were just imposing buildings.
I guess keeping in this thread, Ron, with all the research you did there, what are some of the big things about this mill and the history of it, and that sticks out through your research that just sticks in your mind?
Well, one of the key things you've already alluded to is the incredible price that investors paid for this mill.
Yeah.
So they're building an incredible complex of permanent concrete structures out there. And when you look throughout Nevada and the West, it's not the sort of thing you usually see. The idea is to build very rapid, cheap structures because you don't anticipate long terms of being able to be in production and want to maximize your return.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that there's another thing going on here, which since I live up on the Comstock, we see it all the time, which is the process of mining investors and having a really impressive collection of buildings that you can show investors goes over very well. This is something that on the Comstock you can go way back to its very earliest phases. And 2 of the major early mills there were very major operations, and like this one, were extremely costly. And like this one, they were very short-lived and disasters. So the investors lost a ton of money, and people went to the much cheaper mill designs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of it, is that it really shouldn't be here for this function.
I mean, that leads me into another question, though. What were they thinking? If this wasn't the usual thing to do, did they have much grander plans for this, and then the price of silver just tanked all those plans? Or, was there some other intention here? I don't know. It seems odd that they would do this if it wasn't the usual thing.
Well, it seemed that they had a really good system going for mining low-grade ores all the way up and down the Comstock.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not a bad idea, because you have to remember that low-grade mining was on the Comstock was very big during the later part of the Depression. It was rejuvenated in the 70s and 80s at the same pits. The Imperial pit that is being operated for this one, Houston Oil and Mineral Company, reopened that same pit and operated and built another large mill, an American Flat, that partially covers the site of this mill.
Okay.
And this process continues right to the present with open pit mining and attempts at underground mining on the Comstock to this day. So it wasn't a bad idea. It just didn't quite work out.
That's crazy. I mean, I appreciate business owners trying something new, but man, that's that's something. What was the fallout from this is what I want to know. So this was a massive construction project. It was a massive opportunity and a massive thing that was happening in the Virginia City area in the 1920s. Has your historical research shown, besides obviously the investors and the company losing a bunch of money, were they employing a lot of people? I mean, what was the fallout after this happened from a historical standpoint, after it closed?
Well, I'm sure people were devastated from what we've seen in the historic record. People were really excited about this project. There was the whole company town that was built around the American Flat Mill. Mm-hmm. It was built right next to the mill site. So there were, a bunch of people living on this site. All of those people would have had to leave. According to the report, some of those houses got moved to Virginia City, but basically it would have been disruptive to all those people who signed up to work at this mill and had their livelihoods depending on this. And that's about the time of the Great Depression too. It's, it's coming on. So, that would have been a future event, but think about how things would have been different if the mill had been successful.
I think that's probably a good point to take our first break, and we will come back and talk about the mill post-closure and what's going on there today. So we'll be back in just a second. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code TAS.
Well, we got a minute. I'm going to buy that truck I've been wanting.
Wait, don't you need weeks to shop for a car?
I don't. Carvana makes it super convenient to find exactly what I want.
Hold up. You're buying a car on your phone? Isn't that more of a laptop thing?
You can shop wherever you want.
I like to do my research, read reviews, compare models. Plus, Carvana has thousands of options. How'd you decide on that truck?
Because I like it.
Oh, that is a great reason.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.
All right, welcome back to episode 87 of the Archaeology Show, and I am talking to Alicia Jensen and Ron Reno about the American Flat Mill up near Virginia City, Nevada. So we've talked about the mill's construction. We've talked about some of the archaeology, some of the architecture and archaeology, for that matter, up near around there. I'm wondering, from an archaeological standpoint, this is on BLM land. Otherwise, Alicia, you wouldn't be involved. So this is on BLM land. When was this first recorded? When was this first put into the archaeological record from a BLM site record standpoint?
So the report that Ron was a part of was completed in 2009. So it's been a little while, but it's it's before I started working at BLM.
Okay. That seems, to be honest, quite late in time, given the prominence of this structure and the mill in general on the landscape. What prompted this recording now? I mean, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, what prompted this recording? What caused the BLM to say, you know what, we need to take a look at this thing and then start doing some stuff to it? What was going on in the area?
Well, it's basically all related to the safety hazards of the site. So as you know, I'm sure a lot of mining and milling sites can be really dangerous. And we've got that whole stay out, stay alive program, on federal lands, where if you see a mine, please stay out, or a mill, stay out, because these ruins can be dangerous. You can have the earth open up under your feet and fall down in some cases. So at this particular site, there was a lot of graffiti of the mill in general and a lot of visitation. So with all that visitation, there were several injuries, and including one fatality. So someone died at the site in 1996. And because of that, the BLM had to publish a federal notice in 1997 to close the historic mill buildings to public entry. So at that time, BLM, they fenced the site, they gated, put signs everywhere saying, please don't climb the buildings, don't go inside, because even with all this going on, with people being injured, people still went in. In our records, we note that the Story County Emergency Response Vehicles responded to at least 6 serious injuries a year at the site, mostly from people falling, because some of the buildings, maybe like 80 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back to that 2009 date, BLM got audited in 2008. Okay. And at that point, the Office of the Inspector General, identified the site as a continuing high-risk public safety hazard and a liability to the U.S. government. So, I mean, that's a lot of words there, but what that really meant is that BLM was being forced to find some way to mitigate the safety hazards that were ongoing at the site. So, we had to complete a study about how are we going to mitigate these hazards? What are we going to do at the site to keep people from getting hurt and possibly having another fatality?
Mm-hmm.
So the study was a part of that. We also did, an environmental assessment for potential of hazmat and other materials out there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's kind of a long story because people had been visiting this site since pretty much it was dismantled,
Right.
Back in the 20s, as soon as it closed down, all the machinery that could have been taken out was just like ripped out and resold. But the buildings were left, and they're really, like I said, they're compelling buildings. So I'm sure people have been visiting since then or soon after then. We have personal accounts of people visiting in the 1950s and 60s and, partying it up and all that stuff, which I would probably have done too if I had grown up in this area.
Yeah. Did a young Ron Reno go visit this mill site, Ron?
Actually, although I've been on the Comstock since the 1950s, I didn't bother much with American Flat. That's a peculiarity of the site that even in regards to Comstock, it's in an out-of-the-way place, and you can't see the mill site from the usual places that visitors go on the Comstock. You have to make a special effort, unless you happen to take the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, which looks right down on it, and now it looks right down on where it used to be.
Yeah. Well, Ron, let's talk a little bit more about that report you wrote. What are some, we talked about some big takeaways from that, but I want to dive a little more into into its position and importance in Nevada's history specifically, because we've alluded to that in several different ways. But what are some of your overall notes in response to that?
Well, this is a mill that, in terms of mining history, it's important, but not tremendously important.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you look at the history of modern architecture, it is really an unsung hero. It's when you think of the period when it was built, it was designed in 1920. This is extremely early for a very modernist type building and using reinforced concrete architecture. When you look globally, you'd have to go to Europe to see a whole lot of innovation in concrete design at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look in the United States, you find comparable buildings, back east, for example, in the work that Albert Kahn was doing in the Highland Park Ford plant. In 1908, he built a structure that looks almost exactly like our fine grinding and concentration plant. But these are in urban areas that are back east and strictly factories and other such buildings. Architects tended to really shy away from this sort of thing, thinking that it was only worthy of interest to engineers, that it didn't really have any artistic value. So it was just during the 1920s and 30s that you start see pioneering architects such as Corbusier and Gropius that are starting to try to mainstream this kind of architecture as true architecture as opposed to just engineering.
Mm-hmm.
But this building, if it was designed by an architect, would have been world famous. It would be in every textbook that has ever been written.
Wow.
But since it's stuck out here in Nevada, where you have to really look to find it, and it's done by engineers, the engineers that were simply employees of United Comstock Mines Company, It was designed by Walter Reed, who was a milling engineer, and A.J. Winding, a metallurgist, two people that nobody's ever heard of.
Yeah.
And they designed this truly incredible building.
So I'm really interested in that. So was this engineer, Walter Reed, I think you said, was he and the other guys that helped build this, were they just trying to make their way in the world and they had this crazy idea to make a new kind of mill? Because it just seems, I'm looking at the pictures right now on the All Around Nevada website on the American Flat Mill. We'll link to that in the show notes. I encourage everyone to go take a look because there's a really cool way to kind of explore the mill site using 3D and stuff like that. So it's a really cool idea. But is there any documentation towards the thinking around why they did this? Because presumably those guys lived beyond the when this mill was out of commission. Did they do anything else that was crazy like this? Did they go on to be famous architects at all at the time? I mean, what was their story?
Well, they were simply trying to design a very efficient structure for its purpose. And there was really nothing wrong with the design of the building, except that one choice of using so much reinforced concrete in it. And I have no idea why they made that particular decision. I've seen no indication that they went over the edge anyplace else. And they both had successful careers. They've had no disasters of note. I don't know why they did this.
Well, as I'm looking at the pictures here, you guys mentioned graffiti in your notes before we started recording this podcast, and I think Alicia alluded to that as well. But I had no idea until I really started looking at these pictures, the sheer level of graffiti and how colorful this place is now compared to probably when it started. It was all probably just silver and concrete back in the day. But now with this sheer amount of graffiti, did you have to, is any of this considered, the graffiti considered historical? I'm sure people have been graffitiing this place up since the 30s would be my guess, but is any of it historical? And did you have to record any of that in the context of the report?
Well, during the report recording, we did extensive color photography of the graffiti and talked to locals about how long graffiti had been out there and the styles that they changed through time. And And what it amounts to is that all the graffiti that was present at the mill during its evaluation and later destruction was only a few years old. The graffiti was very much a work in progress. It was always being superseded by new graffiti, or in one case, a lot of it was removed from the mill to make it more amenable to a very bad motion picture that was filmed on site.
Nice.
But looking at it artistically, it's not only informal graffiti artists that have been very drawn to it. For many years, Peter Goyne, a professional photographer with the University of Nevada at Reno, had been working out there and taking classes up to the site because of the architecture itself as a ruin. It was a very compelling piece of sculpture, and he's done some remarkable photography of it from that perspective. So this is one of the remarkable circumstances where when you look at the photographs of the buildings versus of the ruins, I have to say that the ruins are very much more interesting than the original buildings. Sculpturally, both inside and out, they were simply fascinating places, and endlessly, just a voyage through them was an endless voyage of discovery into different spaces and lighting and shapes and internal pools and internal plantings of vegetation that had appeared around pools of water. There's very high ceilings, there's suspended balconies, there's crypts, there's long hallways, there's endless vistas. It was truly an amazing place as a sculptural design.
Yeah, one of these buildings here that I'm looking at almost looks, I mean, if I didn't know this was a mill, I'd almost say it was a cathedral. Like on the edges here, it looks like flying buttresses almost that you would see in like a Catholic Gothic style cathedral in Europe or something. Yeah, it's just really, really interesting. I definitely encourage everybody to take a look at the show notes for this episode and then go over to allaroundnevada.com and check out the American Flat Mill. We'll have that direct link in the show notes. So let's talk about, you guys have talked about a lot of this stuff in the past tense, and there's been, I can see looking at the pictures how injuries would be quite easy, even if you're not climbing in a shaft. If you're just climbing up on this building, some of this concrete could fall apart and you could slip and fall. And some of this graffiti is really high up, and it looks like it was probably dangerous to do. So, what was the demolition of this site like? How long did that take? And is there anything left, or is it all just completely flattened out?
So the demolition started in the winter of 2014 and finished really early, like in January 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually visited the site a couple times as it was being demolished. A lot of, as you would expect, heavy equipment. It was kind of weird to watch, actually. I don't know how it's just like, oh, I'm watching a historic building being torn down. Like everything in our nature as archaeologists is like to avoid this happening. So
Right.
It was a little bit surreal to stand there and be like, I guess, it's going to be gone soon. It's going to be gone forever after this. And it's really sad. It makes you feel sad. And so what's left out there is pretty much nothing.
Mm-hmm.
There is one small piece of one building left out there that, I thought, maybe if we just leave this one piece of this building, it can kind of serve as a marker to people who used to go there. Likely, I expected it would probably be graffitied immediately. And I've visited a couple times since then. And it's just like, it's kind of disorientating to be out there and remember what the buildings as they were and then not seeing them anymore. So from what I've heard from other locals, is that there isn't a lot of visitation anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But, we tried to do a really good job of capturing everything in photography. As Ron was saying, we have that website. We have what's in the reports. Professor Howard Goldbaum from UNR did these amazing, 360-degree panoramas of like the entire site. So when you look at that website, it really does feel a lot like it did when you were standing out there. Of course, it's not the same,
Mm-hmm.
but this has a lot of documentation trying to keep it alive, as much as we can now that the buildings aren't there. So I hope that answers your questions, but basically nothing is left there, but we're doing everything we can with these mitigation projects to keep sharing information to the public and imagery through all these products.
Awesome. Well, we will take our last break now, and I want to come back and talk about some of that stuff and how people can still experience the American Flat Mill in 2020 and beyond. Back in just a minute.
Okay, you can do this.
I know. Carvana makes it so convenient to sell your car. It's just hard to let go. My car and I have been through so much together.
But look, you already have a great offer from Carvana. That was fast.
Well, I know my license plate and VIN by heart, and those questions were easy.
You're almost there. Now to just accept the offer and schedule a pickup or drop-off.
How'd you do it? How are you so strong in letting go of your car?
Well, I already made up my mind, and Carvana's so easy.
Yeah, true. And sold.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.
Welcome back to the Archaeology Show, episode 87, and we are wrapping up this discussion of the American Flat Mill. And over the break, Ron, you mentioned that there were a couple structures or features, for lack of a better word, that were still remaining from the American Flat Mill. Why don't you tell us about that?
As Alicia stated, all the main mill structures have been removed. However, there's two major structures critical to the mill that can still be seen by visitors and are both visible from the Virginia and Truckee Railroad for anyone that has taken that train ride. One of them is a large gravel pit on the hillside above the mill. In order to make all this concrete on site, the company had its own aggregate pit and its own aggregate sorting plant above the mill site. Those are both visible today. Then the other major feature that was essential for operation of the mill was its connection with the outside world. And that was by a specially built spur from the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, which curves around American Flat and goes right to the mill. So those two facilities are still available to be seen today.
Wow, that's really cool. And I want to talk about a little bit more about that here in a second. But something I was thinking about, Alicia, when you're talking about the demolition, I know obviously there's a huge push for reclaiming and using reclaimed things. Were any of the structures or pieces or concrete or anything from this mill able to be used somewhere else? Did anybody come and say, hey, I'd like that piece for my restaurant or something like that?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. And we thought about that during demolition. So we saved a couple of parts of the concrete walls that had kind of the more interesting graffiti on them. Because, our thinking was, well, maybe somebody will be interested in this and want to have this somewhere and continue graffitiing on it. I don't know, those interactive kind of displays that have been around, but nobody was interested. So that was kind of a bummer. And we did keep a little plaque from one of the buildings. Well, it's not that little, actually. It weighs like a ton. but it was the plaque that said 1922 on it. Uh-huh. And you'll be able to see that on the All Around Nevada website. I believe it was on either the warehouse or the refining building. I don't remember off the top of my head. We were thinking that maybe we could incorporate that into some kind of exhibit. So far, we haven't had success with that. Those are the remaining pieces that BLM has in our office. Pretty much everything else, other than that one part of the building, as far as the buildings go, didn't get reused into anything.
All right. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, that would be neat to see. So let's talk about some other ways that people can experience this and see information about this, because like I said, this website and these 3D panoramas and these pictures and just the way that you can kind of navigate around the website is very, very well done. And I personally am not a huge fan of museums sometimes because it looks like it's just a bunch of stuff behind glass that you can't interact with and you can't do anything with. I mean, I like it from an information standpoint, but it's from just the sheer public. I'll never forget going to the Archaeology Museum in Naples, Italy, and seeing all the stuff about Pompeii. Now, the big marble structures are cool and all, but most of the museum, this huge, huge building, was just beads and things behind glass with no context. And it was like, what am I going to do with this as an information thing? But this website, I mean, I feel like I've learned so much without even reading anything yet, just so much just going through the website and looking through the pictures and the panoramas and just kind of getting and able to experience at least how it was before it was torn down, maybe not in its glory, which would be super cool, but how it was. So what other kind of things have you guys put together to help people experience this?
We have quite a lot of ways that we've tried to capture the history of the mill. The most entertaining ones that I really like to show people, apart from the website, is the documentary for the American Flat Mill. And there's a link to it in the website as well. It's called The American Flat Mill, Icon of the Comstock.
Yep.
And it's posted on our BLM Nevada YouTube page. So it's free. And I've shown it at a couple of presentations that I've done. And Reno stars in there too. So you guys can see his face and hear his brilliance. That's a documentary produced by BLM. We've also done brochures that you could get at our BLM office. We've completed a kiosk that's actually really close to the original location of the mill site. So it's there in Gold Hill at the Visitors Overlook. And that was something I worked on a lot last year. What else do we have? We've got, I feel like I really need to talk about the Oculus Rift. Wow, because those 360-degree panels panoramas that Howard took, you can experience those on an Oculus Rift, which is a virtual reality headset.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so we have one at our office, and we've had a couple of visitors try it on, and I've taken it to a couple of public outreach meetings that we've done, and people always think that's really cool. And there's one in the UNR library, one of the libraries up there. So there's instructions how to use Google Cardboard as a part of that website, the All Around Nevada website. So, I mean, it's quite a bit of resources.
That is really, really cool. I love the Oculus Rift integration as well. You know, just as a side note, because you're making me think about it, do you go to the Society for Historical Archaeology meetings much, Alicia?
No, I haven't gone to a meeting in a while. I was actually supposed to go to the SCAs.
Oh yeah.
But then the you know what happened with coronavirus, and my traveling got canceled immediately, and I was so bummed out.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking of the SHA in particular because, and maybe not next year because it's in Portugal in January, but wherever it's at after that, they have now what's called the tech room, and it's really cool because you can basically book time in there, for free, and just book a few hours or book both days. It's usually Thursday and Friday, and it's a place for people to experience technology in a way that helps them understand how to use it on their own sites. And this is making me think because there were some people that had, and it might have been an Oculus Rift, but it's some sort of VR display device. And they were working, you could actually walk around underwater, an underwater shipwreck that they had documented. But I'll tell you what, probably because it was underwater, but their imagery and their actual, the walking around and doing stuff under there was not nearly as good as the imagery you guys have here. And I can only imagine what this looks like in Oculus Rift. And now that I know you can use it in Google Cardboard, I'm going to go dig out my Google Cardboard and see if I can't do that at some point, because that's pretty cool too. For anybody that doesn't know what Google Cardboard is, you can basically order for almost no money. I mean, it's a few dollars. It's super cheap from Amazon or Google. Just look up Google Cardboard, and it's basically a way to, it basically splits the image on your phone. You put your phone into this literal cardboard thing, and it splits the image into two sides so you can experience it in 3 dimensions. And all you need to do is basically write the code for that and take your existing pictures and do that. And it's pretty cool. So it's awesome that you guys have done that. All right. So what are some other... As we're wrapping this up here, what are some other messages you guys want to talk about? I know the Archaeological Resources Protection Act came into play here. The BLM's Stay Out, Stay Alive, which let me just comment on that real quick. It was just a few days ago, I saw somebody posting on Facebook in one of the archaeology groups pictures. They posted some pictures that led me to dive deep into their profile. And on their profile, they have pictures of them inside mine shafts, down inside of those over near Winnemucca, Nevada. And I'm just thinking, my God, these guys are lucky to be alive with what they've done. And as an archaeologist, I've seen so many mine shafts that are just unprotected. Like there's no barbed wire around them. There's nothing on archaeological projects. Of course, we always report these things. We record them. And then the BLM, the BLM is so overtaxed with this kind of stuff. And there's so many thousands of them throughout Nevada that, you can't possibly get to all of them in a timely fashion. But man, just telling people to stay out of those things, even though we're so curious and we want to explore and see what it looks like, you just got to resist that urge because it is just so dangerous to be inside those things. So tell us a little more about how ARPA came into play in this and all your other preservation efforts.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I'd say the main law that came into play here is the National Historic Preservation Act. Mm-hmm. And that's the law that, required us to do the documentation and go through the process of consultation with the State Historic Preservation Officer and the public and all of that to get people's comments on the significance of this site and how to mitigate its loss. That's the law that holds us accountable to preserving aspects of the mill site. And so speaking about the way that the public and even sometimes archaeologists interact with historic sites, for this one in particular, I can totally understand why people graffitied the site, mm-hmm. but that's something that takes away from the integrity of the historic buildings, because whenever you're thinking of preserving something, you want to try to keep it in its context historically. And of course, back then it wouldn't have been all that color, so it really, that diminishes the character a little bit, but obviously not enough to keep it from being significant. Mm-hmm. And so, I wish people would think about that when they see a historic site or a historic place, like to be mindful of of, that place's character. Because if every historic mill site had been graffitied like that, we wouldn't have any left that retain their historic character. And yeah, ARPA comes into play too, covering historic sites on public lands.
Mm-hmm.
Visitation, people went there and climbing the buildings caused a little bit of destruction too, because it was a very unstable structure,
mm-hmm.
right? And so it would have been, very costly for the BLM to stabilize, which is why we tried to keep people out by fencing it and posting signs like, please don't go inside.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just also want to give a shout out to all the people who do respect sites and visit respectfully and don't take anything and just take pictures and, try to keep the locations safe and all the artifacts and every feature safe. Like, your etiquette that you wish everybody had.
Right. Well, I think one thing that I'm taking away from what you just said there is, one of the reasons this had to be demolished and torn down is because people couldn't respect it. People couldn't stay out. They were getting hurt. They were, in there and couldn't just appreciate it for what it is. And that really is the ultimate reason why this had to really come down. I mean, if we could have just said, hey, stay out and appreciate from a distance, that's one thing, but that just wasn't going to happen. I mean, it's not like this was torn down to put up a Walmart. That's why a lot of archaeology happens. I mean, it's out literally in the middle of nowhere, and nobody's doing anything with it, but we had to tear it down because people couldn't stay out and couldn't respect the property. So that's unfortunate. And I hope that's something that people get from this. Ron, are you planning on any further publication or documentation on this based on that report that you wrote?
No, I think that with everything that the BLM has done, that they've done a very good job putting together a wide variety of ways of looking at this particular site.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to go that direction anymore, I think, because I'm among those that, simply miss the physical mill itself and then just kind of let it go there.
Yeah.
There's one thing that I would like to mention regarding this process, that mitigation is, of course, a very reduced way of appreciating a property compared to being able to keep it in place.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of all the consultations, that's an opportunity for the public to make their decision as to whether a property is worth taking the very, the tremendous commitment and expenses of preserving it in place. In this case, no entity stepped forward that was willing or able to take on administration of such a complex and difficult property. But that's not always the case. There have been many other sites that are fairly similar to this throughout the country, where private groups have been able to step in and take care of problems that are simply far beyond the capability of federal agencies.
Mm-hmm.
So this was something that could have happened, but the public desire to go that far to protect it didn't come forth, and so we have the mitigation options instead.
Right. Well, I guess the one good thing that comes from this is it's not just the people of Virginia City and the surrounding area that get to experience it now. Because of what you guys had to do, we now have all these resources and people around the world can experience it for good or for bad. I wish we could make these things happen with other sites, especially around Nevada, some of the old mill sites and mining sites and different buildings and things like that, without having to tear them down first. That would be nice if the money and the will was there to do that, like you said, but I guess we'll take what we have here because it is really well done, and I appreciate that. Alicia, any final thoughts on this?
Everything that Ron just said, I think, is really important and really, it's true that we can only preserve what people really care about preserving the most, because resources are not infinite. And the BLM does not have those resources either. Something I point out to people is that, at times we have maybe 3 law enforcement officers, but we manage, 5 million acres of land. So, there's only so much work that they can do to stop people from looting or damaging cultural sites. And you've got 2 archaeologists for my entire field office. And we do everything we can, but we rely a lot on our wonderful volunteers, like the site stewards. I really want to give a shout out to them. The Nevada Site Stewardship Program. We work with them a lot. When you have a public that cares and is interested in sites, we can get a lot more done, like monitoring sites to keep them intact, or at least report damages when they happen.
Right.
So I've tried to share all these products with the public as much as I can. And I've really enjoyed hearing people's stories about the mill and what it was like when they visited or what they took away from it. And some of that is also in our documentary, because we have a few locals in that documentary too. So that's cool. And I really hope that everybody listening to this will check out the website and the documentary or some of these other products that we're talking about. And also, I want to say thank you so much for having us on.
Well, no problem. It's been great. And as I mentioned, all the links that we've mentioned from the website to the YouTube documentary will be on the show notes for this podcast at arcpodnet.com/archaeology/87. And again, if you're just in your podcast player, click over to the show notes and you'll see that. You can click right on those links. So thank you very much again, Alicia and Ron, for coming on the show.
It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you.
All right. And again, thanks to our listeners, and check out those show notes, and we'll be back again next time with another great episode.
Thanks for listening to the Archaeology Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. You can provide feedback using the contact button on the right side of the website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeology. Or you can email Chris at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Please like and share the show wherever you saw it so more people can have a chance to listen and learn. Send us show suggestions and follow ArchPodNet on Twitter and Instagram. This show is produced by the Archaeology Podcast Network. Opinions are solely those of the hosts and guests of the show. However, the APN stands by their hosts. Special thanks to the band Sea Hero for letting us use their song I Wish You'd Look. Check out their albums on Bandcamp at seahero.bandcamp.com. Check out our next episode in 2 weeks, and in the meantime, keep learning, keep discovering new things, and keep listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network. Have an awesome day. This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.
Well, we got a minute. I'm going to buy that truck I've been wanting.
Wait, don't you need like weeks to shop for a car?
I don't. Carvana makes it super convenient to find exactly what I want.
Hold up. You're buying a car on your phone? Isn't that more of a laptop thing?
You can shop wherever you want.
I like to do my research, read reviews, compare models. Plus, Carvana has thousands of options. How'd you decide on that truck?
Because I like it.
Oh, that is a great reason.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.